In a quiet little neighborhood tucked away between rolling green hills and perfectly trimmed lawns, there lived a man who took immense pride in his home. His name wasn't important. What mattered was how much effort he had poured into making his house a place he could call his own. Every brick, every flower bed, every corner of the backyard told a story of years spent working hard to build something beautiful. For him, it wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves danced in the breeze and the sun cast long shadows across the street, the man sat on his porch sipping coffee. It was one of those peaceful mornings where everything seemed perfect. The air smelled fresh, birds chirped happily, and the world felt calm. But then came the mailman, walking up the driveway with an envelope in hand. Little did the man know, this small piece of paper would turn his life upside down. The letter inside the envelope wasn't friendly. Far from it. It was from the Homeowners Association, HOA, the group responsible for keeping the neighborhood looking picture perfect. They weren't exactly known for being warm or understanding, in fact. They were more like rule enforcers, always watching, always judging. And today, their judgment was aimed squarely at him. According to the letter, there was a problem with his property. Specifically, the water pipeline running through his backyard. Apparently, it didn't meet the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. Translation? It looked out of place, ruining the uniform look they wanted for the entire neighborhood. Never mind that the pipeline had been there for years without anyone saying a word. Never mind that he had followed all the rules when installing it. None of that mattered now. What mattered was that the HOA wanted it gone or moved, and they gave him exactly 30 days to fix the issue. If he didn't comply, fines would start piling up daily until he did what they asked. At first, the man couldn't believe what he was reading. He stared at the letter, rereading each line as if hoping the words might change. How could something so trivial become such a big deal? Sure, the pipeline wasn't invisible, but it wasn't ugly either. It served a purpose. It brought water to his home. Without it, his garden wouldn't thrive, his faucets wouldn't run, and his family wouldn't have access to clean water. Yet here he was, being told to rip it out or move it because someone decided it didn't fit their idea of beauty. Frustration bubbled inside him. He thought about fighting back, maybe calling the HOA and arguing his case. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't work. These people didn't care about logic or fairness, they cared about control. They thrived on imposing rules, no matter how ridiculous, and punishing anyone who dared to step out of line. Still, he refused to let them win. There had to be another way. That night, instead of sleeping, he stayed up late, poring over documents and maps. He studied the layout of his property, traced the path of the pipeline, and examined every legal document related to his home. Somewhere, in all that paperwork, he hoped to find a loophole, a way to protect his investment while sticking it to the HOA, because one thing was clear. He wasn't going to roll over and play by their unfair rules. As the hours ticked by, an idea began to form in his mind. It started as a tiny spark, barely noticeable, but soon grew into something bigger, something brilliant. What if he could give the HOA exactly what they wanted, but in a way that made them regret ever asking? What if he could use their own rules against them? By sunrise, the plan was clear. It was risky, yes, but also genius. Instead of simply moving the pipeline further into his yard, he would move it onto the HOA's property. Not only would this technically satisfy their demand, but it would also shift the responsibility for maintaining the pipeline onto their shoulders. In essence, he'd be solving their problem while creating a new headache for them. With newfound determination, he reached out to a lawyer to make sure his plan was legally sound. After reviewing the details, the lawyer gave him the green light. Everything checked out. Now all he needed to do was present his proposal to the HOA board and wait for their reaction. When the day finally came to submit his plan, he did so with confidence. Along with the proposal, he included detailed schematics showing how the relocated pipeline would align perfectly within the HOA's property boundaries. He even highlighted sections of their own covenants proving that utility lines crossing common areas must remain accessible for maintenance. Essentially, he was using their own rules to justify his actions. It was poetic justice, plain and simple. To his surprise, the HOA approved his proposal without hesitation. Maybe they thought they were getting the upper hand. Maybe they assumed he'd cave under pressure and move the pipeline somewhere else entirely. Whatever the reason, they agreed to let him proceed. Little did they know, they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. With approval in hand, the man wasted no time putting his plan into action. Contractors arrived at his home, digging trenches along the edge of his property and rerouting the pipeline just inches beyond the boundary markers. Neighbors gathered to watch, some curious, others skeptical. Word spread quickly, and soon everyone in the neighborhood was talking about what he had done. Some admired his cleverness, while others worried about the potential fallout. But one thing was certain. No one could ignore the audacity of his move. For the man, though, this was only the beginning. He knew the real battle was yet to come. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. After all, sometimes standing up for yourself means finding creative ways to fight back. And he had just taken the first step toward teaching the HOA a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The man's idea was simple, but it carried the weight of 1,000 clever schemes. He wasn't just going to move the pipeline, he was going to turn the HOA's demand into their own problem. It was like setting up dominoes in a way that made them fall exactly where he wanted. But even the best plans need careful execution, and this one was no exception. He knew that if he didn't dot every I and cross every T, the HOA could come back at him with accusations of breaking rules or causing trouble. So, he decided to leave nothing to chance. Late nights became his routine. After finishing dinner and putting away the dishes, he'd sit down at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, property deeds, zoning maps, municipal codes, and copies of the HOA's covenants. At first glance, these documents looked dry and boring, but to him, they were treasure maps. Each line, each clause, held the potential to unlock something valuable, a loophole, a technicality, or a hidden advantage. He read them over and over again, highlighting key sections and scribbling notes in the margins. One evening, as he flipped through the HOA's covenant booklet for what felt like the 100th time, his eyes landed on a sentence that made his heart skip a beat. It was tucked away in a section about utility lines and maintenance responsibilities. The clause stated that any utility line crossing common areas or areas owned collectively by the HOA had to remain accessible for repairs and upkeep. That meant if a pipeline ran through the HOA's property, they were responsible for ensuring it stayed functional. A slow smile spread across his face. This was it. This was the golden ticket he'd been searching for. If he moved the pipeline onto the HOA's land, not only would it technically comply with their demand to relocate it, but it would also shift all future maintenance burdens onto them. They wouldn't just be getting the pipeline, they'd be inheriting its problems too. It was almost poetic. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. It wasn't revenge per se, but it was definitely justice. But before jumping headfirst into action, he knew he needed expert advice. No matter how confident he felt, messing with legal matters without proper guidance was a recipe for disaster. So, he booked an appointment with a local lawyer who specialized in property disputes. When he explained his situation and showed her the plan, she raised an eyebrow. For a moment, he worried she might tell him it was a bad idea. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "You're either really smart or completely crazy." After reviewing the details, she confirmed that his plan was legally sound, as long as the pipeline stayed within the boundaries of the HOA's property and didn't violate any other laws or regulations. It was fair game. She even helped him draft a formal proposal to submit to the HOA board, complete with diagrams showing exactly where the relocated pipeline would go. By the time they finished, he felt armed and ready to take on whatever came next. Submitting the proposal felt surreal. He printed out multiple copies, organized them neatly in a folder, and drove to the HOA office early one morning. The receptionist looked surprised to see him, probably expecting another angry homeowner ready to argue. Instead, he handed over the folder with a polite smile and said, "Here's my solution. Let me know if you have any questions." Then he left, resisting the urge to stick around and watch their reactions. Days passed, and he waited anxiously for a response. Would they approve it? Or would they find some way to reject it and force him back to square one? Finally, the letter arrived. His hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope and scanned the contents. To his relief and secret delight, the HOA had approved his proposal. They hadn't questioned the legality or raised objections. Maybe they assumed he was giving in to their demands. Maybe they didn't fully understand the implications of what he'd done. Whatever the reason, they had walked right into his trap. With approval in hand, the next step was execution. Contractors showed up bright and early one Monday morning, trucks loaded with tools and equipment. Neighbors began gathering along the sidewalks, curious about what was happening. Some recognized the man standing nearby, supervising the work, while others whispered among themselves, "Isn't that the guy who got into trouble with the HOA?" someone asked. "Yeah, I heard he's moving the pipeline," another replied. The gossip mill was already churning, but the man ignored it. He had bigger things to focus on. The process wasn't quick or easy. Digging trenches required precision, especially since the new path of the pipeline hugged the edge of the HOA's property line. Every inch mattered. One wrong move, and the entire project could collapse or worse, spark a lawsuit. Workers labored tirelessly under the sun, pausing occasionally to wipe sweat from their foreheads or hydrate. The man stayed close, double-checking measurements and making sure everything aligned perfectly with his plans. As the days went by, the transformation became visible. The old pipeline disappeared beneath fresh soil, replaced by a new route that snaked along the boundary markers separating private yards from common areas. Technically speaking, it now belonged to the HOA. Legally speaking, so did the responsibility for maintaining it. And emotionally speaking, it felt like a victory not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt bullied by those in power. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People stopped by to ask questions or share opinions. Some cheered him on, calling him brave and resourceful. Others expressed concern, wondering if the HOA would retaliate or escalate the situation further. A few even admitted they wished they'd thought of such a clever solution themselves. Regardless of where they stood, everyone agreed on one thing. The man had guts. Despite the attention, he remained calm and focused. This wasn't about showboating or proving a point. It was about standing up for himself in a system designed to keep people like him powerless. Sure, part of him enjoyed watching the HOA squirm, knowing they'd created this mess for themselves. But mostly, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had taken a frustrating, unfair situation and turned it into something meaningful. something memorable. By the time the contractors packed up their tools and drove away, the man allowed himself a small moment of triumph. He stood in his backyard, looking at the newly laid pipeline, and let out a quiet laugh. The battle wasn't over yet. He knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily, but he had won this round. And sometimes, winning one round was enough to change the game entirely. As the dust settled from the construction work, the neighborhood buzzed with chatter. The man's bold move had become the talk of the town, or at least the talk of the block. Neighbors who rarely spoke to each other now found themselves gathered in clusters, discussing what had just happened. Some admired his guts and ingenuity, while others whispered nervously about potential consequences. No one could deny that something big was brewing. The HOA, however, wasn't taking things lightly. At first, they seemed almost indifferent, perhaps, assuming the whole ordeal would blow over once the pipeline was relocated. But as days turned into weeks, cracks began to show in their carefully maintained facade. Inspectors sent to review the newly installed pipeline discovered a complication. Rerouting it onto their property required additional modifications to existing infrastructure. Pipes needed upgrades, connections had to be reinforced, and drainage systems demanded adjustments. All of this came with a hefty price tag, thousands of dollars worth of unexpected expenses. For an organization that prided itself on maintaining order and keeping costs low, this was a nightmare. Board members scrambled to figure out how to handle the situation without drawing too much attention. Meetings were called, emails exchanged, and emergency sessions held behind closed doors. Yet no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape the growing sense of unease spreading among residents. People were starting to ask questions, and not just about the pipeline. Rumors spread like wildfire. One neighbor claimed she'd heard the HOA plan to raise fees to cover the unexpected costs. Another swore someone mentioned cutting back on community events or landscaping services. Whether true or not, these whispers fueled resentment toward the board. After all, many homeowners felt they already paid enough to live in the neighborhood. Adding more money to the bill because of a petty dispute over a pipeline, that felt like adding insult to injury. Meanwhile, the man watched everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to create chaos, but he also wasn't sorry to see the HOA squirm. If anything, he saw it as poetic justice. They had picked a fight over something trivial, expecting him to roll over and comply. Instead, they ended up footing the bill for their own stubbornness. Every time he heard another rumor or saw another tense meeting notice posted online, he couldn't help but smile a little. Justice, he thought, often came in unexpected forms, but he wasn't content to let things rest there. Knowing transparency was key, he decided to document every step of the process. With a smartphone in hand, he captured photos and videos of the construction work, the final pipeline layout, and even snippets of conversations with contractors and inspectors. He uploaded these updates to social media under the hashtag #PipelineJustice, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. His post quickly gained traction, attracting likes, shares, and comments from people far beyond his immediate community. Local news outlets soon caught wind of the drama. Reporters showed up at the neighborhood entrance, microphones in hand, eager to interview both sides of the story. The HOA declined most requests, issuing vague statements about ongoing improvements and community investment. The man, on the other hand, welcomed the spotlight. In interviews, he explained his side calmly and clearly, emphasizing fairness and accountability. "I didn't ask for this fight," he told one reporter during a live segment. "But when someone tries to push you around, sometimes the best response is to stand your ground." His words resonated with viewers. Comments poured in from across the country, praising his creativity and determination. Others shared similar stories of battling HOAs or facing unfair treatment from authority figures. What started as a local dispute transformed into a symbol of resistance against bureaucratic overreach. For many, the man became an unlikely hero. David standing up to a Goliath armed with nothing but wit and persistence. Back in the neighborhood, tensions continued to rise. Angry residents attended HOA meetings in droves, demanding answers. Why had so much money been spent on such a minor issue? Who approved the decision to pursue the pipeline relocation in the first place? And why hadn't anyone consulted the community before making drastic changes? Board members struggled to respond, their usual polished demeanor replaced by visible discomfort. Trust, once strong within the association, began to crumble. Then came the bombshell. Armed with evidence and legal advice, the man filed a formal complaint with local authorities alleging misuse of funds related to the pipeline project. This forced the HOA to conduct an internal audit, which revealed several questionable financial decisions unrelated to the pipeline. Suddenly, the board found itself under intense scrutiny, not just from residents but from regulators as well. Resignations followed, with key members stepping down amid mounting pressure. Despite the chaos, the man remained composed. His goal had never been revenge. It was about fairness, about holding those in power accountable for their actions. Now, as the HOA unraveled before everyone's eyes, he hoped others would learn from the experience. Power unchecked often led to mistakes, and transparency was the only way to prevent abuse. One evening, as he walked through his backyard, he paused near the spot where the pipeline used to run. Things looked different now, quieter, calmer. The battle scars of trenches and equipment were gone, replaced by fresh grass and renewed peace. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax. The fight wasn't entirely over, but he'd won a significant victory, not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in standing up for what was right. Still, he knew better than to celebrate too soon. The HOA might regroup, reorganize, and try again. Or worse, they might retaliate in ways he couldn't predict. But if there was one thing he'd learned from this experience, it was that preparation mattered, knowledge mattered, and courage mattered most of all. Whatever came next, he'd face it head-on with strategy, resilience, and maybe just a touch of humor. Because sometimes life handed you lemons and the best thing you could do was make lemonade and serve it to the people who deserved it most. The fallout from the pipeline drama didn't just ripple through the neighborhood. It turned into a tidal wave that swept away years of complacency. What had started as one man's clever response to an unfair demand became a full-blown reckoning. For the HOA, the cracks in their authority weren't just visible anymore, they were gaping holes, impossible to ignore. And as the truth came to light, the entire community began to question everything they thought they knew about the people running their neighborhood. At first, the HOA tried to play damage control. They issued statements, sent emails, and even held emergency meetings to reassure residents that everything was under control. This is an isolated incident, they insisted. We're committed to transparency and fairness. But those words felt hollow now, especially after the audit revealed how deeply rooted the problems were. Mismanaged funds, questionable expenses, and secretive decision-making. It wasn't just bad leadership. It was a betrayal of trust. Homeowners who had once blindly followed the HOA's rules now demanded answers. The tipping point came during one particularly heated meeting. Dozens of residents packed into the cramped community center, some sitting on folding chairs, others standing along the walls. The air buzzed with tension as people waited for the board members to explain themselves. When the session finally began, the atmosphere was electric. One by one, homeowners stood up to voice their frustrations, not just about the pipeline fiasco, but about years of grievances they'd kept bottled up. "I've lived here for 15 years, and I never realized how much we were being overcharged," said a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone. "Every time there's a project, it costs twice as much as it should. Why is that?" Another neighbor chimed in, his voice rising above the murmurs. "And what about those bonuses? Who approved them? Did anyone even ask us?" The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. Board members squirmed in their seats, fumbling for responses. Some tried to deflect blame, pointing fingers at contractors or outdated policies. Others simply avoided answering altogether, claiming they needed more time to investigate, but none of it worked. The crowd wasn't buying it anymore. For years, they'd accepted the HOA's decisions without question, assuming they were acting in everyone's best interest. Now they saw the truth. The HOA had been more concerned with maintaining power than serving the community. Amidst the chaos, the man whose pipeline sparked the whole ordeal sat quietly in the back of the room. He didn't say much, his actions had already spoken louder than words, but he watched intently as the tide turned against the HOA. It wasn't vindictiveness that fueled him. It was validation. All those late nights spent researching legal documents, all the stress of challenging a powerful organization, all the whispers behind his back calling him difficult or unreasonable, it had all led to this moment. Justice wasn't just blind. Sometimes it wore work boots and carried a shovel dot. As the weeks went by, the pressure mounted. Key board members resigned, citing personal reasons or health issues. Those who stayed faced mounting scrutiny from both residents and local authorities. The man's formal complaint about misused funds triggered investigations that dug deeper into the HOA's operations. Every new revelation added fuel to the fire, turning what had started as a dispute over a pipeline into a movement for accountability. But the fallout wasn't limited to the HOA itself. Neighbors who had barely known each other before began bonding over shared frustrations. Conversations that once revolved around weekend plans or school events now included discussions about governance, transparency, and collective action. People realized they weren't alone in feeling powerless. Together, they found strength and hope. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, a group of residents gathered in the park near the relocated pipeline. Someone brought snacks, another brought drinks, and soon the impromptu meeting turned into a lively discussion. Ideas flowed freely, forming a watchdog committee to monitor HOA spending, organizing regular forums for open dialogue, even rewriting parts of the covenants to give homeowners more say in decision-making. For the first time in years, people felt empowered not just to complain, but to act. The man joined them briefly, listening more than speaking. He didn't need to dominate the conversation. His presence alone inspired others to speak up. A young couple expressed gratitude for his courage, admitting they wouldn't have dared challenge the HOA if he hadn't paved the way. An older gentleman joked that the pipeline saga would go down in neighborhood history as the day we took our power back. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight, and not everyone agreed on how to move forward. Some feared rocking the boat too much, worried about retaliation or further disruptions. Others argued for sweeping changes, pushing boundaries that made even reform-minded neighbors uneasy. Balancing these perspectives required patience and compromise, qualities the HOA had sorely lacked. Still, the momentum was undeniable. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to heal. New leaders emerged, stepping up to fill the void left. By resigning board members, they promised openness, collaboration, and a renewed focus on what truly mattered, creating a safe, welcoming environment for everyone. While skepticism lingered, there was also cautious optimism. Change was possible. It just required effort, persistence, and a willingness to hold each other accountable. For the man who had started it all, watching this transformation unfold filled him with pride. He hadn't set out to lead a revolution, but he recognized the impact of his actions. By refusing to back down, he had shown others that standing up for yourself wasn't just about winning battles. It was about inspiring others to do the same. And in doing so, he had helped turn a divided community into something stronger, more united and more resilient. As the night grew cooler and the group dispersed, he walked home with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The fight hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Not just for him, but for everyone who believed in fairness, transparency, and the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary change. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The pipeline fiasco had shaken things up in ways no one could have predicted, but life always finds a way to move forward. For the man at the center of it all, the dust had finally started to settle. The HOA, once an unshakable force in the community, was now a shadow of its former self. Board members resigned one after another, leaving behind empty seats and unanswered questions. New leaders stepped in, promising reform and transparency. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The changes didn't happen overnight. At first, skepticism lingered like a stubborn cloud. Many residents wondered if the new board would truly be different, or if they'd simply repeat the same mistakes under a fresh coat of paint. To their credit, the incoming leaders seemed determined to prove themselves. They organized town hall meetings where homeowners could voice concerns without fear of judgment. They published detailed financial reports online for everyone to see. And perhaps most importantly, they stopped micromanaging people's lives. Gone were the nitpicky rules about flower colors or mailbox designs. Instead, they focused on bigger picture issues like improving shared spaces and addressing real safety concerns. For the man who had sparked this transformation, watching these changes unfold felt bittersweet. On one hand, he was proud of what he'd accomplished. His actions hadn't just solved his own problem. They had forced the HOA to confront its flaws and become something better. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. He hadn't set out to dismantle an organization or make enemies. All he'd wanted was fairness, a chance to live peacefully without being bullied into submission. But sometimes, standing up for yourself meant igniting a fire that burned brighter and hotter than you ever intended. Despite everything, the man remained humble. When neighbors thanked him for taking a stand, he shrugged it off with a smile. "I didn't do anything special," he'd say. "I just refused to back down." And in many ways, that was true. He hadn't wielded power or wealth or influence. What he'd done was simpler and harder. He'd taken a stand when it mattered, armed only with determination and a willingness to think outside the box. His story became legend in the neighborhood, told and retold at dinner parties, backyard barbecues, and casual chats over coffee. Parents used it as a lesson for their kids. If someone tells you something is impossible, don't believe them until you've tried everything. Newcomers heard about it during welcome meetings, often accompanied by knowing nods and wry smiles. Even years later, whenever anyone mentioned the HOA, someone inevitably chimed in with, "Remember that time someone moved the pipeline onto their property? Man, that was genius." Yet beyond the laughter and admiration lay a deeper lesson, one about accountability and the importance of questioning authority. The pipeline saga reminded everyone that power unchecked often leads to abuse. It showed how easily rules designed to benefit a community could be twisted into tools of control. And it proved that even ordinary people could challenge giants not through brute force, but through creativity, persistence, and a refusal to accept injustice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the man sat on his porch sipping tea. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. Across the street, children played tag while their parents chatted nearby. Everything felt calm, almost serene. It was hard to imagine that this peaceful scene had once been overshadowed by tension and conflict. He thought about how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood, but within himself. Before the pipeline incident, he'd been content to keep his head down and avoid trouble. Now, he realized that staying silent wasn't always the right choice. Sometimes, speaking up, even when it was scary or inconvenient, was necessary. Not just for your own sake, but for the sake of others too. Justice rarely came knocking on its own. It had to be invited in. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. The battle scars from those months, the sleepless nights, the stress, the endless research had faded, but the lessons remained. He knew the HOA might never fully recover its old reputation, nor should it. Trust, once broken, took years to rebuild if it could be rebuilt at all. But that was okay. Communities weren't built on perfection. They were built on growth, on learning from mistakes and striving to do better. In the end, the pipeline wasn't just a utility line anymore. It had become a symbol, a reminder that standing up for yourself wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about planting seeds of change, however small, and trusting that they might grow into something meaningful. For the man, that knowledge was worth more than any victory. And so, as he watched the world wind down around him, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The fight had been exhausting, yes, but it had also been worthwhile. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead for himself or for the neighborhood, but he knew one thing for sure. If anyone tried to push him around again, he'd be ready. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't the ones you win against others. They're the ones you win against fear, doubt, and the temptation to stay silent.